Hello and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Coming up a little bit later in the show, we'll meet a Belcourt, North Dakota woman who makes art out of birch bark. But first, joining me now is our guest, Adam Rain Arvidsson from Minneapolis, Minnesota. And your new book, you're here to talk about Wild and Rare, Tracking Endangered Species in the Upper Midwest. Now, we'll get to that in a few moments, but first off, tell the folks a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be on today. It's exciting to talk about this book. It's obviously a subject that I've spent a lot of time on and I'm very interested in, so it's good to be able to share with your viewers a little bit about the book. I'm trained as a landscape architect, and I've practiced in the Twin Cities for more than 20 years as a landscape architect, but I've always had kind of a sideline of writing, driven by my real love for the natural landscape. I'm a bit of an aficionado of landscapes. I even enjoy very much the drive from the Twin Cities up to Fargo. It does change a little bit more than some people think it does. It's pretty subtle, but you know, I'm not a mountains guy or an oceans guy. I kind of like them all, and so I've always written. I've written environmental literature for magazines and such, and it's always been a bit of a sideline, so I've kind of mixed that design appreciation for the landscape as well as the written appreciation for it, and that's kind of the impetus for the book.
Yeah. Well, now, so why did you write this book?
So this book really originated, I was on a trip to Ely, Minnesota, to the International Wolf Center, on an assignment, a writing assignment for a magazine. And I had gotten the opportunity to hear the wolves howl there. I was sitting around, and the captive pack sort of burst into this amazing sound. The whole pack kind of howling together, and I was really moved by it. And I was doing some research later that night about the wolf, and found out a lot about its very controversial listing on the endangered species list, and then the delisting, and it seemed like a fascinating story in and of itself. But as I looked deeper, I kind of thought to myself, well, what other species are there that might be on the endangered species list? And as I started to tick off that list and found that there were freshwater mussels, there were plants, there was the lynx, there was a small prairie stream minnow. They were all over the place, and really inhabiting every corner of the state of Minnesota and beyond, and every different landscape type, and really kind of had every possible relationship with humans you could have. So they were being affected by water quality, by recreational development, by agriculture. It was all over the place. And so I thought to myself, if I profiled every species on that list, I might get a clear picture really of what the landscape of the upper Midwest looks like. So the species were kind of that lens that I used to really untangle the complexities of our landscape, which is a very diverse landscape. You know, people, you know, call us flyover country and think it's not as grand as some other places, but there's a real interesting diversity in our landscape that I wanted to unpack a little bit, and the species were the vehicle to do that.
Yeah. With that said, though, as I look through the book, you talk about your research. Mm-hmm. I mean, how long did it take you to do this? And talk some more about the research.
So I worked on this book for about 9 years, and when I started and kind of came up with the idea for that list, I started contacting scientists and doing, frankly, some pretty sometimes mind-numbing research in the Federal Register documents, which tells us exactly how the federal government is going to manage these different species, learning about the different histories, and then getting into the field. And that was really the most fun part for me. Is there was a cadre of scientists that were very generous with their time with me, who let me tag along on their field expeditions. So I got to wade in creeks and seine for minnows. I got to climb up ladders 30 feet in the air, propped against cliffs in southeastern Minnesota, looking for plants. I tracked lynx in the winter in northern Minnesota. So that research took place over the 9 years, kind of a little bit each year, and then doing all the subsequent research, books, Federal Register, interviews with other experts, and those began to then come together as almost standalone chapters for each species. But I did always see it as a book from the beginning. I thought it would come together as one complete picture of the Midwestern landscape.
Okay. A lot maybe to hit on, but let's start with a couple animals first. The lynx and the wolf. What's
Yeah.
their status in Minnesota now?
So the lynx and the wolf are both on the endangered species list right now. The wolf is a fairly fascinating story because it has it was one of the original species listed in 1973. It has come off the list and been put back on the list and off the list and on the list several different times, in part through court action. So actually the chapter on the wolf in the book is sort of me following the wolf in court, not so much following the wolf in the wild. So that's a fascinating story there. But right now it is currently on the list, so it is a protected animal. And the same with the lynx. The lynx has been a protected animal for some time now. What's interesting about the lynx is that it was added to the endangered species list because it was felt that there weren't many that were breeding or resident in northern Minnesota, that maybe they were just crossing over the boundary from Canada and not staying very long. And then subsequent research that was enabled by the Endangered Species Act listing has now been able to document generations of lynx having kittens in northern Minnesota. So it is a fully resident animal in the United States, in the Midwest, which is a pretty exciting discovery that's been made possible by the listing of that animal.
Mm-hmm. Well, for those who don't know, is hunting lynx and wolf legal in Minnesota?
It is not. Minnesota did have wolf hunts for a couple of seasons when the wolf was off the list. But now that the wolf is back on the list, hunting wolves is not legal in Minnesota, nor across much of its range. Lynx typically would have been an animal that would have been trapped as a fur bearer, along with bobcat and other animals that are legal to take. The lynx is technically not legal to take. It's hard to tell the difference between a lynx and a bobcat. Sometimes it's felt lynx are bigger, but they're actually not. They're very similar in size. So there's actually been a lot of good training that has been done with trappers associations to understand how to tell the difference and how to safely free a lynx, while the bobcats can obviously be kept.
Wow. So then, you talked about the Endangered Species Act a few times here, and you said it was passed in 1973. But how is that act working today?
The Endangered Species Act, through all the research that I've done for this book and talked with a lot of scientists that manage it in the field, the Endangered Species Act really does work. It has been successful in seeing species recover and then be delisted. Part of the reason for the Endangered Species Act being passed in 1973 was because we were losing the bald eagle, the symbol of our nation. And now the bald eagle is off the list. I think people report seeing many more bald eagles today than they did 30, 40 years ago. So the act is working. There are a lot of efforts right now to quote unquote modernize the act. And many of those efforts would actually provide a lot more oversight of endangered species back to the states. And in some cases, there's legislation moving through that would make the Endangered Species Act entirely unworkable, such as the automatic delisting of a plant or animal after 5 years, unless the Fish and Wildlife Service repetitions to have it on the list. Now, there are hundreds of species on the list, so a constant repetitioning effort would certainly make it problematic to keep species that need protection on the list.
Yeah. With that said, talk about the plants and things that are also endangered, and maybe go through a few of those.
Yeah, the plants, there are 4 plants in Minnesota that are on the federal endangered species list, and 2 of those plants do have ranges that slide over into the Dakotas, and those 2 are the western prairie fringed orchid. It's a native orchid. Orchids are amazing. It's the largest plant family that there is. They're very showy flowers. And so there is an endangered orchid that lives in the prairies, typically wet prairies, especially the beach ridges of the Lake Agassiz Plain. And then the prairie bush clover is also another prairie plant that does occur in the Dakotas as well as in Minnesota. The prairie bush clover it's lovely, but it's a fairly unremarkable, I guess, inhabitant of the prairies. What's interesting about the prairie bush clover is it has served under the Endangered Species Act almost as a surrogate for an entire landscape. So this plant was listed way back in the 1980s because its habitat was disappearing, because the prairie has been mostly eliminated. And so by protecting the prairie bush clover, by restoring prairie where it can live, it's actually had a benefit across the entire prairie ecosystem. So those are two interesting plants with their stories. And the other two plants are there's a succulent plant, a type of sedum that grows out of cliff faces in southeastern Minnesota. And it seems to be an Ice Age leftover, that it is holding on in these cold river valleys and nowhere else. And then the last one is a plant that is found only in Minnesota. It's the only species that is found only in Minnesota, and that's the Minnesota dwarf trout lily. And it only exists in 3 counties in Minnesota in the entire world. That is, the complete range. So clearly endangered because of a very limited range, and a real need to protect that from a variety of different impacts.
Yeah, but that's it. And of course that one may be a little easier, but for most of us, we wouldn't even recognize this. So what can be done or is being done to protect these species?
Yeah, the number one thing that's being done to protect species is habitat. You know, or the top 3 reasons might be habitat, habitat, habitat. The habitat loss is probably the one thing that is true for every species on the list in terms of how it's being impacted by humans. And so the protection of existing habitats, existing prairie remnants, existing forest remnants, as well as the restoration of prairie habitat are the biggest things that people can do. And right now, one of the most threatened group of endangered species are the butterflies and insects. Butterflies have been very hard hit. There's a couple of listed butterflies right now that have gone from being as common as squirrels in the landscape to 500 individuals left over the course of about 15 years. And again, in part because of habitat. And people can restore habitat for pollinators on their own properties. Planting prairie species, things that flower throughout the year, flowering trees, that kind of stuff. The people can really do that, and it does make a difference.
Now, how does driving on a beach in Texas impact Minnesota's northernmost bird?
Yes, so we're talking here about the piping plover, which is a small shorebird. It's just about 7 or 8 inches long. It's pretty adorable, honestly, and it migrates from the northern Great Plains, especially actually the Missouri River Valley in North Dakota and the Alkali Lakes areas, down to the Gulf Coast in Texas. And I went down to Texas to learn about the piping plover. And in Texas, one researcher told me in Texas it is a God-given right to be able to drive on the beach. And even in the national parks in Texas, driving is allowed on the beach. So the piping plover nests on the open beach, not up in the dune grass, not down by the water, just right there on the open beach. So the disturbance of them, they're not nesting down there, but they're still feeding kind of all along that area. That disturbance puts a lot of stress on them, makes their long migration. I mean, for a 9-inch bird to come all the way to North Dakota, nonstop, puts a lot of pressure on that. They may fail the migration. But the other big issue with piping plovers is nesting habitat up here in the upper Midwest. And the channelization of rivers and the removal of kind of gravel banks and gravel beds in the rivers is a big deal. It really limits the nesting availability for those birds.
So how do ranchers and farmers figure into all this?
Yeah, I spoke with some ranching families, especially for my discussion of the Topeka shiner, which is a small minnow that lives in prairie streams in southwestern Minnesota and eastern Dakotas. This is a fish that was thought to be really sensitive to water quality. And so sometimes with ranching operations, if there's a creek running through the land, the cattle are just drinking from that creek, and they do trample the river banks. It can be a bit of a mess. So I talked with a rancher who, he felt like there was this difficult tension between really needing to feed his family and frankly kind of feed the nation, but then also understanding that there were, in the case of this rancher, they had found a significant number of Topeka shiners in the creek on the land that it ran through, and he was both proud of that, but also didn't want that to restrict his ability to use the land in a way that was productive. So that tension is always there with any of these species. And in the book, I go into a bit more detail for each one about kind of what are the trade-offs between making sure that we have the ability to do what we need to do to survive as a species while also protecting the co-inhabitants of our world.
Has anything surprised you in your research and your findings?
I feel like there were surprises around every corner. The piping plover, fascinatingly, there's these birds that all congregate in one place on the Gulf Coast, and then they migrate northward in really 3 separate populations, and they keep those separate. So it's like, even though the birds are completely mixed in one area, it's all the birds that came from North Dakota. They know to go back to North Dakota. They don't ever go to the East Coast.
You mentioned the wolf. Why is the wolf ending up in court?
Well, the wolf is in court because, to put it simply, humans have had a complicated relationship with wolves throughout the entire histories of both species. You know, when we think about our lore, I mean, we use the metaphor of the wolves to mean a variety of different things, ranging from freedom to like depravity and destruction of cattle. So there's always been this tension. There was a government-sponsored extermination effort around the wolf as the settlers were moving west across the United States. And there's a real divide in the country between those that really just don't want wolves around and those that think that the wolf is the symbol of the wilderness and needs to be protected at all costs. And so that leads to differences of opinion about whether the wolf has been recovered fully or not.
Adam, can you read a passage from your book real quick?
Certainly. I actually do have a passage about the wolf here. And this was an experience that I had not so much with wolves in the wild, but actually wolves at a zoo. 5 wolves are alert and restless. They trot under the young spruce trees in that focused, unflagging way wolves move. Wolves don't ever seem to either walk or sprint. They are still or they jog like marathoners. These 5 wolves circle their enclosure in intertwining loops, never running together, never running all at once, each wolf alternating between that intense, wide-eyed jog and a stock-still stand that is almost as disconcerting. They are agitated, interested. The coyotes in the pen next door are being fed. The wolves, separated from the coyotes by a black chain-link fence, perhaps wonder if they will be fed next. They associate the handler with food, for this is their captive life. But even here, ensconced, they seem wild. A small black one stares me down. It trots right up to the fence and cocks its head and shoulders to the side, not tilting them, but sort of reaching sideways with its neck, as if trying to look at something behind me without moving its torso. Its eyes are bright yellow-gray, its face is relaxed, and its feet are enormous. I stare back, something I know I would never be able to bring myself to do if this were not a controlled encounter. The wolf both meets my eyes and doesn't. It's looking right at me. I can tell because sometimes it glances away for a moment and then returns its gaze to my face. But I don't feel there to it. I find myself glancing behind myself to see what the wolf is really looking at. Beside me, leaning casually on the wooden rail, are 2 girls, maybe 16, brightly dressed, hair in ponytails, sparkly things festooned about them. They are watching the black wolf too. "It's so scary," says one, "like a creepy werewolf." Responds the other, "It's so cute, I just want to cuddle with it."
Adam, thanks so much for joining us. Great research, a great book. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Stay tuned for more. Denise Lajmadir creates amazing works of art with merely her eye teeth and a thin layer of birch bark. She shares her passion for this ancient Ojibwe Cree art through workshops as well as her poetry.
It's spiritual for me and it's healing. It's just a reflective time for me. Birch bark is everything to Anishinaabe. Ojibwe people was our homes, our wigwams, it was our baskets, it was our canoes, our medicine. utensils. I feel very fortunate that I'm able to work with the birch bark and to have learned the art. I was born here in Belcourt in the early 50s, and my father was a carpenter. He was unable to find work, of course, in the winters. So we relocated out to Portland when I was 6 years old. I started first grade there, and I continued on through my freshman and sophomore year at Portland State University. We would come home during the summer, which I absolutely loved. I wanted to stay here. I saw a flyer at Portland State University for Northern Plains Indian Teacher Corps program, and you had to be going into your junior and senior year, which I was at that time. I applied for the program and was accepted, and happily packed one suitcase, got on a train, and came home. I got my teaching degree. So we are going to talk about Mazinibikajige, which is the Ojibwe word for birch bark biting. I was doing a poetry reading at the Eiteljorg Museum, and it was a time when they also had their native art show. I was walking around outside under the tents, and I saw a dragonfly bitten onto a piece of birch bark, and I asked Kelly Church what that was, and she explained it to me. Absolutely fascinated, and that's something I want to try to do. And we fold it with the light side out. She sent me all of the tricks of the trade and became my mentor, and she was so generous with her knowledge of birch bark biting. I was fortunate that I have the teeth to be able to do the biting. You have to use your eye teeth. I close my eyes because I see the design sort of in the darkness. Kept practicing for about 4 years before I felt confident enough to start selling my work. I received a grant, the Minnesota State Historical Society Native Americans Artist in Residence Grant. Very carefully unfold it. That award was absolutely life-changing because it allowed me to study the history of birch bark biting. There you have it. Birch bark biting is a pre-contact art, and a very ancient old Ojibwe Cree art. Any tribe that lived along usually the northern part of the United States that had birch trees did the art. This is a beautiful piece of bark. It's got probably 15 layers to it. You have to be patient in peeling, so it teaches you patience. And then once you peel that, you can fold it in all kinds of ways, hundreds of ways. And then you bite down using your eye teeth. Beautiful, keep going, don't open it, keep going. And then you have to be very patient again when you open it up because it can tear very easily. So once people open it up and see their design, the look on their face, I'm a teacher, so the look on their face is just like Christmas. It's like opening up a little present. And then when they hold it up to the light, to the sunlight or to a light, and they see their designs, the light shining through their designs, it's a moment of awe for them. And it's fun for me to watch them discover what they've done.
Oh, look at that.
Yeah, hold it up to the light.
Beautiful.
And no two designs are alike, they're like snowflakes. So nothing you bite is wrong or isn't beautiful. So everything they do is absolutely gorgeous and is right. This is called birch bark biting. I study the spring peeled bark gathered when leaves unfolded. Thunderbirds, wings spread wide, gaze back at me. Peel the amber bark into thin layers, careful not to tear claw marks. Place the folded bark in my mouth, biting down with eye teeth. Closed eyes see designs, unfold a flower, turtle, or dragonfly. Hold it to the light, feathery bite, marks glow through transparent wings. I love the way birch bark sounds. I love just the way it feels. It's a very healing, peaceful thing for me to do, to be able to do. I absolutely love working with birch bark.
Well, that's all we have on Prairie Pulse for this week. And as always, thanks for watching.
Funding for Minnesota Legacy programs are provided by a grant from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4th, 2008, and by the members of Prairie Public.